Good afternoon. Good. Thank you. Welcome. I'm Greg Rosenbaum. I'm the Senior Director for South by Southwest EDU, and it's a distinct privilege to introduce this next panel. It really brings together an impressive group of leaders working to confront systemic barriers in higher education from both the researcher and the student perspective. Addressing the racial disparities that continue to exist in education, this panel will bring together leaders working to better understand and provide concrete solutions to improve opportunities going forward. Joel Bervell is a medical student and social media medical content creator in his third year at the Ellison S. Floyd College of Medicine. Janel George is an associate professor of law and the founding director of the Racial Equity in Education Law and Policy Clinic at Georgetown University. Anthony Abram Jack is an assistant professor of education at Harvard University and author of The Privileged Poor. Jonah Martinez Goldstein is a senior at Williams College and an advocate for student representation and education policymaking. As a quick reminder, there will be Q&A at the end of the session where you can ask questions and upvote the questions you'd like to have asked through Slido and the Engage button in the mobile app. Please join me in welcoming the panel to the stage.
I don't know why I got this, like I'm gonna hold it.
Me too. This is like the hotel pillow that you're just like,
What to do?
maybe I'll just move this.
Well, hello everyone. We are so excited to be here at South by Southwest. I know, like many of you, this is our first time being in person. It feels very surreal. And today we're so excited to bring to you a panel about confronting systemic barriers in higher education.
Yeah, higher education is a necessity today. And while a college education is now at the center of educational pathways and success for so many students, the path to making it there, thriving, and succeeding after college is more fraught today than ever, especially for Black and brown students.
And there's a lot to talk about. The Supreme Court agreed in January to decide whether race-conscious admissions programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina are lawful, raising serious doubts about the future of affirmative action in higher education. And I want to also acknowledge that even here in Texas, there are currently things happening with students from the LGBT community and whether they feel safe at schools.
Colleges are moving steadily away from SAT, ACT requirements for admissions, as well as states moving increasingly to jettison high-stakes exit exam regimes around the country. These tools of exclusion have so long affected Black and brown students most acutely, so the continued re-envisioning of a high school to college transition is really crucial for equity today.
Mm-hmm. And everything from Operation Varsity Blues cheating scandals to the recent bomb threats that were at HBCU institutions have made people be thinking about higher education and the ways that it impacts us every single day. Education determines who gets access to jobs in the future and is front of minds of people in the news, all of us as educators, as students, and as parents.
So here today, from 4 different perspectives, 2 students and 2 scholars, we want to approach the systemic challenges to getting to, staying in, and succeeding after a higher education.
But we don't want to get too carried away, so we're going to each go and introduce ourselves and a little bit about the work that we're doing right now. And we're going to start with Professor Jack.
Hi everyone, this is really an honor to be here. My name is Anthony Jack. I'm a professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education and the assistant professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And I'm particularly excited to be here today because I study, work on, and am a first-generation college student. And so when I think about the experiences of and the hurdles that many first-gen and lower-income students face to get into higher education is both my life passion but also my professional passion, especially when you consider the stratification in higher education, right? Lower-income students are disproportionately more likely to go to for-profit and less selective colleges than their wealthy peers, right? In the United States, we're talking about, 38 colleges have more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom 60. Right, so we're talking about the stratification, and we know going to elite schools or going to more selective schools means higher graduation rates, more resources, more opportunities to explore everything from internships, mental health services, access to mental health services, and a whole host of things that are happening on campus, let alone getting in.
Absolutely. Professor George?
Thank you all. It's also a pleasure to be here and to be with the other esteemed co-panelists here today. I have worked actually in the legislative and policy arena in Washington, D.C. And what I kept finding in my work is that education, access to quality education, seemed to undercut so many other issues, whether it was healthcare, whether it was socioeconomic issues. And so I have focused my work on racial equity in public education. I worked with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, specifically on policy. And it's a little different because a lot of other lawyers litigate. But I realized that policy could be extremely powerful, and particularly policy that's informed by those people who are directly impacted, right? That I saw a little bit of a gap, a division. People were in Washington, D.C., and the term we usually use is in the Beltway, inside the Beltway, making these policy decisions that were disconnected from the actual realities and the lived experiences of the very people who would be directly impacted by the policies that were made, particularly students of color in public education. Another thing that really bothered me as well was what I saw as the experimentation, if you will, of most of these different education reform policies. Again, mainly on children of color. So I really wanted to take a more active role in helping to shape and craft policy in cooperation and collaboration with impacted communities. And that's why I'm just enjoying running a new legal clinic. It's actually Georgetown Law's newest clinic. The law school is 19 clinics. And Georgetown's the largest law school in the country. It has this tradition of clinical legal education, similar, I guess, to a teaching hospital, right? Where law students get to actually practice law. They learn more about the law by practicing law, but most law students don't get the opportunity to do that kind of legislative lawyering. So that's what I really wanted to teach students, and that's the kind of work that I wanted to engage in the clinic.
Mm-hmm. I'll introduce a little bit about myself as well. So I'm a third-year medical student right now at Washington State University, and as a Black man in medicine, that's a rarity. In the entire United States, less than 5% of all physicians are African American. And that's a statistic that can be seen across many schools, even now, with students. At my own medical school, I was the first Black student at my medical school, which is shocking to think about. And it puts a lot of burdens on students to have to think about who's coming next afterwards and how are we going to actually open those doors of opportunity for those who come next. So I've thought a lot about that. Going into medicine, actually getting to this space, being able to find mentors who can guide me and take me along the pathway. But I also use a platform on social media via TikTok and Instagram to really share what it's like to be a medical student right now and disparities that exist in the healthcare field in all aspects of the word, whether that's disparities in the types of people that are actually in medical school, disparities in the care that people receive, whether they're Black, brown, indigenous, and how that varies amongst different people. And so I think when we talk about systemic barriers in higher education, it's important because, especially in the medical field, having a representative workforce can change lives, literally. And so that's why I am so passionate about these types of issues and making sure that disparities in all ways are actually addressed and can be mitigated.
Then last, a little bit about me. My name is Jonah Martinez Goldstein. I'm a senior at Williams College. And what brought me to ed reform was really my experience in public schools. You know, in New York State, we have these exit exams called the Regents exams, which have been around since the end of the Civil War. So they're pretty deeply entrenched, and mine was the guinea pig class for Common Core rollout. So we had an even more extreme experience with standardized testing than most classes are used to. And for me, it was really the manifest failure of this system in myself and my peers that brought me to thinking, what could we be doing differently? I remember, in middle school, especially, students are often so excited, to be doing, be getting a homework assignment, to be doing different projects, to be learning in the classroom. By the time we got to high school, so many students were just detaching from the classroom, from an interest in learning, not seeing themselves in the honors or AP classes, not seeing themselves being able to succeed at a high level, So thinking about how to move away from some of those systems, I got connected with one of the members of our Board of Regents in the state who encouraged me to think about alternative pathways. And since then, I've been researching a number of schools in New York City, the New York Performance Standards Consortium, a group of alternative public schools that have been able to implement performance assessment alternatives to our Regents exams. They perform so much more highly, especially when it comes to student outcomes for our most marginalized students. So relative to New York City public school averages, they're able to really raise achievement and graduation outcomes. And this is just a group of public schools in New York State that are, like so many others. So being able to find real viable alternatives is really something that is certainly possible in New York and around the country, and advocating for those and for better student representation and student voice when it comes to policymaking around assessment and pedagogy and curricula is something that I've been really interested in.
Awesome. And one thing I do want to note is we're going to be allowing you to ask questions all throughout. So if there is a question that comes up, feel free to put that in the Q&A and we'll answer it as we're going along.
Great. So Professor George, our first question for you. You've been so deeply invested across different organizations to further access and equity in schooling. From your time at Georgetown, your first time at Georgetown to LPI, to the LDF, now back at Georgetown. Can you tell us more about this path of yours, how you got to where you are today, and what guides your work now?
Thank you. So ironically, you all have to share, Joel and I found out that we're both from Seattle. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington. I initially went to Seattle Public Schools. So I'm the youngest of three. I have an older brother and an older sister. And I was too young to really know what was going on, but they were encountering discrimination in the public schools. For example, my older sister, she's 4 years older. Her teacher approached my mother and father and said, oh, well, I think that she should be placed in remedial math, right? And so my parents thought, okay, well, she's not the greatest in math, right? Now, this is kind of an aside, but you'll see the connection. So we're all voracious readers. My mom still works in the public library system. We all read early and we're reading several grade levels above our grade levels. So my mom always says it's when the teacher approached her again and said that she should be placed in remedial reading that she knew that there was something more going on, right? And so we all moved, myself and my siblings, out of the public school system into the private Catholic schools in Seattle. And so just that incident, and again, I was too young to really know what was going on, but that change, right? That sense that we weren't being treated equally, that we were being labeled and stigmatized, stayed with me. And I think that that's partly what informed my desire to attend an HBCU for college. Initially, and we were talking about this, I was hesitant because often, even when you are in a geographic location where there's not a lot of black people, there are still labels that are fixed on you as a black person, right? That you're a sellout or that you're trying to be white. And this is not across the board, so I don't want to make generalizations, but sometimes folks project those labels and then sometimes they become internalized. So I went through my own thought process, right, with college, and I thought, okay, maybe an HBCU, but I don't want to be in an environment where people are telling me I'm not black enough, I'm not talking black enough, et cetera. And so I went to visit an HBCU where my sister was enrolled, and I realized, wait, that's not actually the case here. These are black students of color who have had experiences that are very similar to mine, of being the only one in certain classes, right? Of being the one who spoke funny, talked funny, right? And so I realized, wait a minute, I can come here and not feel that stigmatization, that I can actually be affirmed and embraced. And that's exactly what I experienced. So I went to Spelman College in Atlanta. It was such an affirming experience, not only because I had professors who cared about me, deeply cared about me on a personal level, but because my curriculum was infused with different voices. So for example, I was in the honors program. In my honors philosophy class, we read all of the philosophers that other folks read about, but we also read Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. And so I learned this different orientation. I was an English major, and so yes, we read Shakespeare and those those kind of works, but we also read the works of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance and Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks and other Black feminist thinkers. So really just awakened my senses to the importance of Black voice, and I carried that with me. I went on to law school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which certainly was not as diverse as an HBCU, right? But was very supportive. And so when I graduated, I knew I wanted to do some kind of advocacy, some kind of public interest law, but at that time I thought, well, the only way to do that is like through working at legal aid or something like that. No one tells you that there's a such thing as a legislative lawyer, right? And so I kind of made my own way. I did a fellowship called the Women's Law and Public Policy Program at Georgetown Law, and that introduced me to the world of policy. Mm-hmm. But I also realized so few people, particularly people of color, had access to the halls of Congress. They didn't feel like that those policy-making bodies were for them. And it was interesting to witness different families come to Washington, D.C. for vacation, right? Because some people would come on Capitol Hill, and you could tell they had this sense of ownership. I belong here. I should be here. And then other people didn't have that. And I realized how important it was to open that access and to share that information. And that's what I've tried to do throughout my work, apply a lot of the lessons that I learned working for members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, in advocating for legislation and policy that promotes racial equity in education.
Yeah, I want to pick off right there, because it's interesting. I could not afford to go to an HBCU. My choice set, and a lot of people, and there's a lot that goes into it, right? My choice set was either staying in Florida at a specific school so I can get Florida Bright Futures, or go to an elite school, because only the elites had money. And I ended up going to Amherst College. I wanted to start there because Adam Harris has a book called The State Must Provide. And in it, he talks about the intentional underfunding, the intentional crippling of historically Black colleges and universities, right?
Right.
And one thing I was listening, I was reading this book, and it goes through the legal history of the people whose names are on the legislation that opened up higher education, that actually led the way for Brown v. Board of Education, because the desegregation effort actually did not start in K through 12, it started in higher education. So when you look at SIPL, when you look at some of the other cases, it actually starts as a foundation. But what I was interested in this particular moment was I did some research behind the endowments. And endowments mean what the colleges can afford to do. And Phillips Exeter Academy, which is a private boarding school in was it Vermont, New Hampshire? I can't remember right now.
New Hampshire?
I think it's New Hampshire, right?
Thank you.
They have a $1.3 billion endowment. That is the equivalent to the endowments of the 3 biggest HBCUs in the country. A high school that educates fewer than 1,500 students has a endowment that is equivalent to the 3 biggest and most endowed HBCUs in the country. There's a reason why those schools can't give financial aid to open the pathways of the great Black way to many individuals. There's a reason why a certain type of student is able to go to an HBCU, especially the flagship ones, if you want to use that language, and be able to afford to do so, right? Kamala Harris was not an accident. People forget. Parents had a certain level of resource and the like. But for those of us who didn't have the opportunity, when you see that sticker price and actually see just how much sticker price is left over after financial aid, yeah, I took myself to Amherst College. Because Amherst introduced no loan financial aid policies. They adopted that policy in 1999, right before I graduated high school. Princeton began it in '98. And so now roughly roughly 80 colleges have some variation of a no loan financial aid policy. And they are doubling their number of Pell eligible students at the school. Vassar doubled their number of Pell eligible students in a 3-year period. Now they're giving all these statistics about 1 out of every 7 students, 6 students, 5 students are first gen, are low income, are Pell eligible, respectively. And like, oh my God, all this diversity is like really, really happening. Wow. And then you realize, okay, but access is not inclusion, as I say in my work. right? Getting in is one thing, making it through to graduation is another.
Right.
Right, and so when we start thinking about all those mechanisms through which exclusion happens, but I want to even take a step back and say, we actually have to pay attention to where students are coming from. Because the story that you told, and even my own story, matches just how exclusive these places that damn near guarantee graduation, that almost guarantee employment, that guarantee less money for paying for college exist. In my research, I show that 50% of the lower income black students at elite colleges are actually the alumni of boarding day and preparatory high schools. Andover, Exeter, Deerfield, St. Paul, Choate, Hockaday. These schools that cost $50,000 and $60,000 a year for 9th grade, right? 1/3 of Latinx students are also the alumni of boarding day and preparatory high schools. But when we think about it, how many students in the country, regardless of race, gender, class, go to private school? A fraction. How many of those students are black? A small fraction of already a small fraction. How many of those black students at private school make less than $40,000 a year? A fraction of a fraction of a fraction, and yet they represent 50% of the lower income black students at elite colleges. They were hedging their bets. They were getting their new diversity from old sources. The reason why I bring this up is because the pathway even to these particular schools asks us a very troubling question. Why do we have to put black and brown students, especially who are lower income, in private schools to give them a shot at a decent education? That's right. Right, these are fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves, because it points to the fact that it's not the difference between a good public and a bad public, whatever as loaded as those terms are, because the true gap in America is those who are able to pay for school and those who have to those who go to schools that are local. Because we know the experimentation, the no excuses charter school. Right? We know that they actually do as much damage as they do good, or sometimes even more damage, because when those students get to college, as Joan Golan at Vanderbilt shows, they don't have that sense of independence, because they're so used to a very rigid way of being a student. Right? But what happens when you think about also the fact that the schools that lower income students go to, because of funding laws in the country, are just even more drastically different than what we had previously imagined. A black family in America that makes $100,000 a year lives in as disadvantage of a neighborhood as a white family that makes $30,000 a year. Right? When you look at the sociological research about differences in places where people live, let alone where they are educated, because those effects are compounded, you see that the pathway to college is even steeper for other populations. And then we're talking about affording it. And the only way you can afford many of these schools is you got to go to the schools that have these billion-dollar endowments, and then you're like, oh, well, are you leaving us? Right? Or are you, can you come back? And then when you get there, are they actually prepared to support you? Or do they think that a financial aid is enough? Here's a check, come here, be quiet, be happy. And so we have both things. Where do we go, right? Who's allowed to send out 40 or 50 or 60 college applications, regardless of fee, versus who is not? Who would love to actually have a class and have a black teacher for the first time in their life? Who would love to be able to be surrounded by other students who come from similar backgrounds or have similar experiences, or rather learn about their history not just in a bastardized curriculum, but actually begin to explore and put it in a larger context. There are so many people who cannot afford to have that level of education because of the historical legacy of exclusion that we have in both our neighborhoods and in our schools.
Professor George, I want to turn to you, because I know you have so much to say about that historical kind of legacy and the origins that have come from there. Can you share a little bit about those historical origins and how that impacts today, the things we see in higher education?
Absolutely, and I'm sorry, I was just getting so lost in what you were saying. I was like, wait, so I just echo a lot of what was just said, and want to just underscore these disparities are intentional. I always tell my students, public policy has a purpose. These disparities didn't just come out of nowhere. They're not just accidental, right? And public education has always been a battleground, always. There was a reason why early in our nation's history, most jurisdictions had laws on the books making it a crime for enslaved Black people to learn how to read or write. There's a reason why it was a crime, because enslavers recognized that access to education would not only equip enslaved Black people with the tools to become deepen their awareness of slavery, not like they didn't already know how bad it was, right? But that they could communicate with each other, band together, right, to contest slavery. So enslavers recognized that. And not only was an enslaved person who dared to learn how to read or write criminalized, but whoever taught them to learn to read or write was criminalized. Frederick Douglass talks about this in his narrative. He talks about how he actually tricked his white playmates into teaching him how to learn to read. So it dates that far back, right? It wasn't until the Civil War, the conclusion of the Civil War, that we actually saw the formulation of our contemporary public and publicly funded education system. And ironically, it was the then emancipated Black people, formerly enslaved Black people, many of whom, by the way, were elected to Congress. We had 16 Black congressmen during Reconstruction, okay, who led the way, led the charge for the creation of the contemporary public education system. So they led the fight back in their home states for inclusion of state language providing for public education. It became a condition for readmission to the Union after the Civil War to include language for the provision of public education. And many historians think that had education been more widely available, not just for formerly enslaved Black people, but also for white people, that we may never have had a Civil War. And so those same Black officials who led the charge for the creation of the contemporary public education system fought for public funding, fought for expansion of public education, but unfortunately what we saw, and this goes to what you were talking about related to curriculum, was curriculum directed to Black children was focused on preparing them for lives of servitude, on rote memorization. Carter G. Woodson, who was a scholar, talks about this in his book, Miseducation of the Negro. And it was designed to keep Black children kind of these lower levels of society, essentially, right? And so then what we saw, by the way, I do want to point this out. This is one of the first things I talk to my students about. So there's no federal right to education. If you search the US Constitution, it's not there. That's why there's so much reliance on state constitutional language, whether it's in litigation, right? Brown versus the Board of Education, you can't sue the United States because they actually don't owe you an obligation to education, which is actually very disturbing, right? And so most of these battles are fought at the state level, and education, as we all know, is extremely localized. And so not only were a lot of Black children relegated to curriculum that was limited, they were also relegated to segregated schools under this regime that was created in the post-Civil War to maintain this racial subordination known as in the South as Jim Crow, which I want to be clear also existed in the North, right? And so Black schools, although publicly funded, were intentionally under-resourced. And so when Black people, namely Black educators, and by the way, there was a point where we had a lot of Black educators. He talked about the lack of representation, right? They were well educated because a lot of Southern schools they maintained segregation, they didn't want to educate them, so they sent them to Columbia Teachers College, right, to get their teaching credentials. And they fought for resources. But a lot of those Black educators and litigators who fought for integration were not just fighting, they weren't fighting for this ideal of having Black children sitting next to white children. They were fighting for resource equity. They were fighting for all of the things that came along with integrated education. And to be clear, there's documented research about the benefits of school integration for all students, not just students of color, but for white students, okay? But they were fighting for resource equity, right? They were fighting for access to curriculum, to facilities, to all of these things that have consequences for educational outcomes. So then we have Brown v. Board, and I swear I'll wrap up this history lesson in like 2 seconds. We have Brown versus Board of Education, which was not a silver bullet, right? Most people talk about Brown v. Board in 1954. Most don't talk about Brown too in 1955, because a lot of Southern states, under the guidance of the Southern Manifesto, vowed to defy the ruling. Prince Edward County in Virginia, one of the defendant school districts in Brown v. Board, closed their public schools for 5 years rather than desegregate them. And that's when we saw the emergence of vouchers, of privatization, of all these other efforts to circumvent, right, desegregation, and so many things that we're still hearing about, right, that negatively impact public education. So I just say that all to say we have this historical context. And what we're seeing now, Jonah, you mentioned the Affirmative Action Challenge. There's a ton of legislation to restrict curriculum, et cetera. It's not new. We have to look at things in their context. What we're seeing now, it's not ahistorical, it's not acontextual.
And Javier asked a question, actually, that I want to tie into what you just said. The question says, so are non-traditional education pathways, i.e. non-degree seeking programs, the alternative for Black, Latinx, et cetera, students? And the reason why I wanted to pair it here is those pathways were often just built into the curriculum and built into the underfunding of specific schools to make sure that not only was college not even an option, right? They weren't even talking about college. They wanted to place students, especially Black and brown students, indigenous students, in very specific positions. And so as we live in a society where we live in even more of a credential society, where having a BA, let alone a BA from a good school or a master, quote unquote good school, or a master's degree or higher, is the economic, social, and health and public health returns are increasing year after year. And that's what we're actually seeing, right? So if you look at the socioeconomic returns on education, or even like the difference in lifespan between having an AA and a high school diploma is significant, then a BA, then a master's, then a PhD. So it's not that, and I'm not arguing that those pathways should not exist, because when we did have unions that were robust, you can actually live a very secure life without having a BA. You can get a license, you can get trained in a different sort of way, but with the decline of unions in our country, we're not quite there anymore, right? And so what I don't want, and I'm not trying to say college is for everybody. I'm the first person to say that it's not, right? Different forms of college is not necessarily for everybody, but we shouldn't set up a system that makes a no the de facto answer for certain groups. And that's the hard part about any kind of vocational training or vocational education. Now, there are people who are at the conference who are actually highlighting the work of attaining specific skills, especially in this knowledge economy around coding, around technology, that you don't necessarily need a full 4-year residential or 4-year degree to be able to do because of the training and the things that you can actually have. But for state or even national policy, given the structural and the entrenched structural inequalities, to try to say we want to bring that back or invest in it and believe that it won't be racist or sexist, it's very hard for me to believe, right? Think about, I would personally, I'll give you an example. I would love for us to bring back home economics, but not in the gendered sexist way that we had it. I would love for somebody to teach me what a Roth IRA was. I would have loved to teach someone to teach me about taxes, about home economics, about writing a check. When I actually applied to graduate school, I can't even share this story. When I applied to graduate school, I thought I wrote a check for my applications, but I didn't know you had to sign it, because no one in my family had a checkbook. I was the only one, because everybody had bad credit, right? There was nothing, there was no, some people, like the unbanked communities that we have because of either no money or no trust in banks, that's real, right? So I got a call from the University of Pennsylvania, and the woman just called and said, okay, you got in, but you didn't sign the check, so you have to send us another check. And I said, you have to sign it. And she did not understand that there are people who have never written a check before in their life, right? And so I don't want, and so like home economics in a truer sense, to get students prepared for actually doing things instead of like the guy on TikTok who's like, I wish I would have known this before I was in my 30s, that guy, right? A lot of that could actually be in that particular class, because it's very, very, I watch reels on Instagram, so, but it's very, very real. And so that's just important for us to think about. It's like, if we're going to bring back these pathways, can we do it in a way that's not neutral, but actually proactively engineer in a way to help those who are going to be disproportionately on them, and not let it be a segregated labor market creator? That to me is really important, because when you think about Brown v. Board, we have to remember Brown v. Board actually did shut down some great all-black schools in the hope that you will be equalizing the country, especially in DC. Because I remember reading Derek Bell, Face at the Bottom of the Well, and he was like, he was the only one sad the night when that decision came in, because he looked over and saw what was coming. He wasn't as optimistic as everybody else in the room. So when we think about the pathways, we have to think about them, again, in that historical legacy, and how segregated they can become and lead to a very, very different experiences.
Can I say something about that? I'm sorry, y'all. Jonah and Joel are about to. I just want to say something about the vision, right, that the Legal Defense Fund lawyers and the black educators who I mentioned had of desegregation. It was so different from how desegregation was actually implemented.
Yes.
So I want to flag, the black teachers were supposed to be integrated along with the students, right? But there was opposition from white parents who said, no, I don't want a black teacher teaching my child. And it was supposed to be two-way. White children were supposed to go to black schools, black children were supposed to go to these traditionally white schools, right? And that's not what happened. Because of residential segregation, what happened instead is a lot of the burden was placed on black children. A lot of them were put on buses, and I want to be clear, there were some cities that did two-way busing still, but for the large part, black children, right, were required to get on these buses and be transported across town to these majority white schools with white teachers who knew nothing about them or their communities, who didn't want to teach them. To be clear, the black educators were fired. They were fired. Principals were demoted to bus drivers, and they sued. A lot of them did sue to try to keep their jobs, but for the large part, they were extinguished from the workforce. There's a figure, it's something like 35,000 black educators in the South lost their jobs in the years following Brown. And it was in part for retaliation, because it was black educators who led the charge for school desegregation. But they had a different model. Vanessa Siddle Walker talks about this. They had an additive model. They thought that school desegregation would add to the kind of affirming and nurturing environments they created in the classroom for black children, and they thought that it would just add the resources. But that's not what happened in implementation. So today when we talk about the shortage, for example, of black educators, it was intentional. It was intentional. We had a strong black teaching workforce at some point, right? And so much again of what we're facing and what we're seeing was intentional. Derek Bell talked about his idea of interest convergence.
Yeah.
In which he says the interest of black people in achieving racial equity will never be met unless somehow white people have an interest in it as well. And he says that Brown was a result of interest convergence. And if you look at some of the briefs, like the brief filed by the State Department, the U.S.'s reputation abroad was becoming tarnished, right?
Yes.
Countries like Russia, well, that's not really a great country to mention right now. Let's say that abroad, countries were covering the Jim Crow South. And they were saying, look how they treat their citizens in the U.S. The U.S. espouses democracy, what hypocrites they are, and a lot of black people were moving abroad, right? And so the State Department filed a friend of the court brief in the Brown case for the plaintiffs because they recognize the value, right, of integration.
Professor George, this makes me think, even given, a lot of these changes that became a lot more meager than you're saying, a lot of educators and litigants expected, the post-Brown, and then when it gets into the Johnson years with the Great Society, we get, Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, compensatory education policies, affirmative action, and, to the extent that it, survived, busing for a number of years, what in deficit terms is known as, the achievement gap, actually started to close for the first or the only time.
Oh, absolutely.
In U.S. history, and even these advances were too far for the conservative administrations that replaced Johnson. So in the 70s and 80s, we see this movement from equity and a focus on equity to excellence and raising standards and expectations, but jettisoning a lot of the policies that actually did help Black and brown students to achieve higher, to graduate in larger numbers. And so that's around the time that we see minimum competency tests and then exit exams, all sorts of standardization, funnel into public schooling. So I was just wondering if you could talk sort of about even, post-Brown, how there has been this retrenchment, from, the 70s, and then, even through, the 90s and early 2000s, into No Child Left Behind, and even Race to the Top, and then of course the Trump years, just how we have moved farther and farther back from even those policies that did work and that were achieving, progress.
Sure. Well, I'll say a couple of things. First, this, and I think someone did have this question, right? Disinvestment in public education, right? At the local, state, and federal levels. And I won't get technical here, you all, because school finance is very technical. But a lot of jurisdictions raise their revenue for public education through property taxes, right? So if you live in a district that is quote unquote property poor, meaning that you don't have high home values, right? You are not able to generate a lot of revenue for public education, even if you tax yourself at a higher rate. That's what the San Antonio versus Rodriguez case was about in 1973, in which the US Supreme Court basically said, well, funding inequities between majority districts of color, in that case specifically a Latinx district here in Texas, versus a higher wealth, all white district, again, the result of policy and intentional redlining, residential segregation, right? That's not a constitutional violation. And by the way, you don't have an explicit or implicit federal right to education. So the US Supreme Court kind of shut its door, right? Shut the door on addressing these kind of funding inequities in public education. And by the way, the federal government doesn't actually fund a ton of now it's vital funding, as you mentioned, Title I, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Federal funding of public education is about 9 to 10% of overall education funding. The remainder is split about 50-50, depending on the state, between state and local, right? And so that's why so many of these disparities along racial lines, along socioeconomic lines, are allowed to persist. And Jonah, as I noted before, a lot of these kind of practices that impact public education are not new. I mentioned the Southern Manifesto, which triggered this era known as massive resistance. That's where we saw the funneling of public education dollars to private school vouchers, to private education. In the South, they were known as segregation academies, right? It was a way to maintain racial segregation. And so we see those still continue. And now people distort history. They distort the origins of these schools. But that's why it's important for us to contextualize even what we're seeing, these anti-critical race theory bans, right? Which, by the way, critical race theory was a legal theory developed by scholars in the legal academy to analyze the role of the law in perpetuating racial inequality in a post-civil rights era, right? Derek Bell, who you mentioned, the late Harvard law professor, his student, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, and so many others, right?
Names you don't hear at all in these debates.
Right, and now people make critical race theory attached to anything to do with race, and that's not what it is, right? And I wish my colleague Gary Peller at Georgetown says, wouldn't it be a great thing if students in K through 12 education could engage in something as analytically complex as critical race theory? But if you're in 8th grade, and I hate to say it, and you're struggling to read, you can't even get to critical race theory. You can't do it. And so it's a confluence of policies, right?
And the thing is, the reason why I love that as a kickoff point is we also, whether we want to highlight supposedly racial privileges, but then we always do an erasure of when affirmative action was white. When you think about the GI Bill, when you think about FHA loans, when you think about literally the policies that set up the middle class, it was not only just whites need only apply, it was white men need only apply. Because when you talk about the armed services and the GI Bill, it was white men who benefited.
That's right.
Like even though black, any person of color who served was supposed to get access to those rights, there was discrimination built into the very program, and people did not get those resources. So the very programs, and when affirmative action was white is the name of a book, when the very programs that built the foundation of the American middle class, that actually set up the differences in the quality of neighborhoods, because you had a middle class enclave that could be taxed at a lower rate and get more money for the schools, you already set up the policies that were for them. Right. And that's what gets me with this new affirmative action case, right? Because don't get me wrong, if you want to have a conversation around preferences in that mission, let's go. I'm 100% for it. But please tell me we're going to talk about the discrimination against women who have been outperforming men in standardized test scores in every academic arena, but yet our colleges are still 50-50 men-women in traditional standard binary terms. Are we going to actually talk about legacy admissions, where the only qualification is your mama or your daddy went there before you? Or are we going to talk about the way in which athletics gets you in the back door, the side door, and the front door at even places that are not on quote unquote on TV all the time? As one person asked me, why is it that Harvard, Yale, and other places that are technically D1 schools still allowed to do likely letters through athletics that aid you in getting in? Are we even going to talk about how donor relations to schools, all of a sudden you get a new library, you get a new chair, you get a new building, you get a new rock on a campus, right? If you go to schools now, you're gonna see a proliferation of things with last names on them. And all of a sudden, those last names are gonna also match the admission rolls. So if we're gonna talk about admission into the school and preferences that are happening, why are we only talking about one that actually at least has a justification to, if not, as we moved away from affirmative action, righting the wrongs of past actions, but at least having a benefit for society? Because as Joel mentioned, right, we are only as good as not only a educated society, but a diverse educated society. The way in which we bring in different perspectives, the way in which so many different fields are actually left behind or behind 20 years than where they need to be because there were no women, there were no people of color, let alone women of color in the room. Think about how many times you have to adjust the lighting to do a filter that was on Snapchat or Instagram because the skin, the way in which the coating and the cameras and everything, it was so used to seeing lighter skinned faces. That when they put it, or hell, even when you're washing your hands when you go to the automatic things, because you have to turn your hand upside down, right? Literally, like not having a person of color in the room to even be like, oh, this isn't working for me. Oh, that would at least put it 5 years beyond where we are right now. We are only as good as our boardrooms, classrooms, conference rooms, legislation as our diverse, educated citizenry because we ask different questions. Our experiences in this very, very diverse country, both geographically and everywhere else, forces us to ask different questions. But yet we want to focus on this one specific thing that at least has a legal grounding on addressing the very policies that were created by the government that now are going to be sanctioning, right? You were okay with redlining and blockbusting and all of these different policies that created the ghettos that you wanted to meet, on your thing and get mad at Anthony Bourdain when he doesn't want to show a certain version of Philly or a certain version of Philadelphia. Well, that's y'all fault, right? And so all these different things that you're talking about, no one wants to have that conversation. And I think it's very interesting, especially I'll give it over, that to put it in their term, the discrimination against women, given that their test scores and achievements, quote unquote objective achievements, have outpaced their male counterparts for at least 2 or 3 generations of college-going students, no one wants to have that conversation, let alone how that has a ripple effect when you talk about race and socioeconomic status. But we want to focus on one particular thing, yet we are perfectly happy. Because I had a conversation with people who are saying affirmative action should go, but yet this one man at an event that I was at stood up and said that there should be a minimum number of children of alumni in each class. And I stood up and I said, so you want a quota system? Because now you're okay with the quota system, and yet we got here because of you lobbying against it. And so this opportunity hoarding that is happening in America, that return these intentional acts to hoard opportunity, to hoard resources that one, you believe that you have an a priori right to, that the other group is less than and therefore should not have access, and all of a sudden your actions are geared towards keeping this boundary between the resources that you want and the people that you don't want to have it, because that's what we're seeing. And it's going to tear us apart. That's why I'm actually glad that many schools are moving away from legacy admissions. Amherst did it. Hell, MIT did it a long time ago, and no one batted an eye.
Can I make one minor point? And I swear, this will be my last historical reference or whatever.
Go on, Janel.
It's the only time we're going to hear it.
I just want to flag one thing. We mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. So there was an amicus brief. These are friend of the court briefs, right, that are submitted to help convince the court. And we always hear about the doll test, right, where black children were shown a doll, and a white doll and a black doll, and asked which one was bad, which one was good, right? So these were tests actually that were being conducted by the husband and wife psychiatrist team of Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark over a decade before Brown was even filed. But what the court didn't talk about in its actual opinion was the research that they submitted showing the harm of segregation to white children. The court reviewed that, it considered it in making its decision, but it's not outlined in the opinion. But we're all harmed by segregated education, by this opportunity hoarding. All of us pay a price for that.
I want to throw one more history lesson out there. So this, I'll take it over from you. But in the field of medicine, when you look at the American Medical Association, years ago, their Council of Medical Education put together what's called the Flexner Report. Abraham Flexner went around to the different medical schools at the time, looked around and said, it is in a deplorable state. And he took the model that was at Johns Hopkins at the time, which was 2 years of first kind of general basic sciences, and then 2 years of more education when you're actually out into kind of the field, and said this should be the standard. And essentially what he did was any school that did not have that medical school, he told the AMA they should shut it down. What ended up happening was 5 of the 7 HBCUs, essentially, colleges that were dedicated to producing physicians of color, and then all but 1 college that was dedicated to producing women were closed. And so what you see today is, once again, that intentionality that we talked about, that things weren't just kind of made into this way. And now what we're having to go through is figure out how do we actually replenish the system, especially in a field like medicine, where many people don't go into that field unless they know someone there. It's long and hard. You have to do 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and there's residency, which can be up to 8 years, and then you have to get a job, right? And so it's a long pathway, and if you don't know someone that's in there, or you don't know the systemic barriers, for the we didn't even talk about finances really today at all, but when it comes to applying to medical school, it literally costs $10,000 per applicant. That's the average, what it takes to get into medical school. That's the applications, which are $100 a piece. That's the travel, which is actually having to pay upwards of $500 to get your ticket, your air ticket, and also hotel rooms. And it's not even to mention what you pay when you're in medical school. For practice exams, it is $600 to take the step 1 exam. It's $800 to take the step 2 exam. If you're coming from a community where you can't pay for that, how are you even going to be able to get through that? Or if you don't know about those things coming up and those roadblocks that might approach you, what do you do in that situation? What's really interesting to look at, because of the COVID pandemic this year, is many schools changed the way that they did their traditional looking at students. They took away the interviews. You didn't have to actually travel anywhere. We used Zoom instead. They took away application fees. They took away the requirement for the MCAT. What ended up happening was this year, there was an increase of 20% of people from underrepresented backgrounds applying into medical school. Wow. And this year's class increased by that same amount in terms of people that came into medical schools. And so I think what we see is when we actually remove these barriers that exist right now, financial or emotional or whatever it may be, and we actually look at the history of what led us here, it makes a big difference. I know we're wrapping up on time, but Dr. Jack, we didn't talk about hidden curriculum really quickly. I want you to hit on it, if you can.
You have 30 seconds.
I know, 30
seconds.
The thing is, I'm glad that we're ending here because a lot of the conversation started on, the getting in. Like, can we actually get people to the gates? But the real question is, what happens once they get in? Mm-hmm. What is part of the hidden curriculum? Those unwritten rules and unset expectations once they're in. You actually mentioned one, right? Internships and shadowing are a big part of medicine. But if your mom or your dad or your aunt or your uncle or grandparents aren't doctors, how are they going to be able to show you that way in? How are you going to understand those unset expectations of ways to get access to the resources and experiences? So I hope that at the end of this conversation, we think about not just getting in, but that first day of campus, that first day on campus.
Absolutely. I want to say thank you so much. We're at time right now, but we're hopefully going to be able to stay for a little bit. So if you have questions, come up and ask us. And thank you so much for allowing us to be here, share our thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. The book?